All right. Good morning, all, and welcome to our Bible study. And we're continuing to look at the Jesus said what hard sayings of Jesus. And this week we're looking at Mark 12:18-27, where Jesus says there's no marriage in heaven. So kind of building off of last week, we talked about the divorce is adultery. This week we're talking about no marriage in heaven. All right. And could someone read this for us?
And Sadducees came to Jesus, who say that there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but leaves no child, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. There were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and when he died, left no offspring. And the second took her and died, leaving no offspring. And the third likewise. And the 7th left no offspring. Last of all, the woman also died. In the resurrection, when they rise again, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as wife. Jesus said to them, Is this not the reason you are wrong, because you know neither the Scripture nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong.
All right. So any initial thoughts on that?
I'd be a little suspect of the wife there.
Okay.
I think if I'm number 5, I'm going to say, Dad, please don't make me.
Right. Well, so if you remember the story of Judah and Tamar, that's part of this. How this happens, that Judah has 3 sons, Tamar marries the first one, he dies, and so in order to keep the line going, then the second son's supposed to marry Tamar, but the first kid they have is like Judah's first son's, counted as Judah's first kid. But so the second one doesn't want anything to do with this, and so he gets struck down, and then Judah goes, well, shoot, I don't want my last son to do this, to get struck down or do this. So he sends Tamar away, and then Tamar has to, dress up as a prostitute to fool Judah and get him to fulfill his duty, kind of thing. So, which all of which is to say that at least that part is from the commands that we have in the Old Testament, but which sounds really weird to us, but recognizing and remembering that a widow would have no power, no authority, no ability to buy property, no nothing. And so it was a way for the widow to be provided for, and it was a way for the person who died, their line, quote unquote, to live on. Is that, okay, so you died, so next brother gets to do this. It needs to take responsibility and set up. That's the kind of the intent of that idea. So that part isn't necessarily weird. Although, I mean, it sounds weird to us. It wouldn't have necessarily sounded weird to the people Jesus is talking to, but there's parts of it that do. All right, any other thoughts? Yeah.
Titles like aunts and uncles back in Old Testament time.
Mm-hmm. There's some of that, yeah.
Okay, so if the third brother is the biological father, he's really considered the uncle because the first deceased brother is the
right for the first kid, and then subsequent ones would be counted as his kids.
okay.
Yeah. So. All right, but it's intentionally, I think, made that way. Again, Judah, we've got 3, but here we've got 7, and it's intentionally made ridiculous because, first off, who's asking Jesus the question? The Sadducees. And what's unique about the Sadducees?
They don't believe in resurrection.
They don't believe in the resurrection, right? So, if you remember, so the two groups of Jews we get to hear about in the New Testament are, or, the two kind of parties, so to speak, are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Pharisees, often get painted as the bad guys, but they're also the ones who are trying to keep religious purity. It's that they've gotten too legalistic in doing that. That's their issue and why they don't trust Jesus. The Sadducees, on the other hand, are the ones that have more acclimated to the culture, so to speak, in a variety of ways, including seeing things as much more philosophical than theological. And so the Sadducees say there's no resurrection or angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So the Pharisees believe there's a resurrection, but that happens at the end. The Sadducees don't believe there's necessarily that don't believe in a resurrection. They're not looking forward to that. They're focused on the here and now, not on some heaven light years away or anything like that. The third group active at this time is the Essenes that we kind of see with John the Baptist, but they're the ones who were hiding out in the wilderness, and they're why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they thought the apocalypse was coming, so they were hiding out in caves in the desert and hid everything in clay jars that no one would bother for 2,000 years. So those are the three groups. So part of it is, when we're looking at this question, is recognizing who's asking the question and who Jesus is responding to. And so the Sadducees have made up this question and made it kind of intentionally ridiculous, going to 7 kids, 7 sons with one wife, because they don't care about the answer to the question, who in the resurrection when they rise, whose wife will she be? Because they don't think there's a resurrection. So they think this whole thing's ridiculous anyway, but they think they can trap Jesus in doing this. So this is the main time they're mentioned. The Sadducees are mentioned in the gospel. In Acts, several times when Peter or Paul or some of the other apostles are put before the Sanhedrin, which is the religious council that's made up of Pharisees and Sadducees, and told to stop preaching in the name of Jesus or things. Peter or whichever disciple speaking will talk about the resurrection, and then suddenly you've got the Pharisees and Sadducees arguing with each other about whether there's a resurrection or not, and then the disciples are able to kind of get out of it because the argument get distracted by their own inner council arguments and aren't worrying about what's going on. What's going on in front of them. So that's the first thing when we're looking at this question of, are we married in heaven, is that it's the Sadducees asking the question, who don't believe there's a resurrection, don't believe there's an afterlife, and think the whole thing's ridiculous, and they're just trying to trap Jesus. So there's no honest intent here on the question. I mean, sometimes you get these people coming to Jesus and are asking honest questions, and Jesus will help them, although sometimes they still won't understand the answers. But he can tell when people are coming just to trick him or trap him, and this is one of those times.
So is there still today Jews that don't believe in resurrection and angels and spirits?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously these parties kind of have morphed and changed and things in the intervening 2,000 years since then. Pharisees especially, if they're focused on things like sacrifices at the temple that haven't been able to happen for almost 2,000 years. Things shifted to the synagogue, and things shifted to be a bit more philosophical and less theological in general. But you've got still, because just like in Christianity, you've got a huge spectrum of Judaism. You've got the Orthodox on one hand, or even the Hasidic, or kind of even more so we're going to follow all the Old Testament laws and all the rabbinic codes to the letter. So we're not going to shave our beards. We're going to have Moses said, put the scripture on your doorposts and things. So we've got little boxes with scripture on our doorposts. Those kind of things. And on the other hand, you've got the Reform Jews that are going to be much more philosophical. much more kind of similar to the way that some of the more liberal mainline Christian denominations interpret things. There's going to be a lot more focus on helping others and that kind of thing, and loving one another, and less focus on any divine commands that make us uncomfortable. And then there's also, of course, a whole branch of mysticism stuff that's even weirder. Madonna was into Kabbalah for a while. That's Jewish mysticism. So there's still kind of that group. You've got some that would probably believe in a more literal, yes, there's a resurrection at the end when God comes to judge everything, and there's much more, well, this is just a nice philosophical system that we have that we're going to follow until we die, and then who knows what, if anything, happens. So, all right. So Sadducees don't believe in resurrection, so they're trying to trick Jesus by asking this question. A couple ways we can sort of define things too, as we're thinking and talking about this. That heaven is a disembodied state of bliss when we rest from our labors or in the presence of God. Is one way to kind of define how we're talking about that. Versus then the resurrection is the event on the final day when our perfect souls are united with transformed bodies. After that, we spend eternity with the Lord in an embodied perfect state. And so recognizing too that when we're talking about what happens after death, there's a couple different things going on there that we can sometimes conflate into being one thing. Recognizing there's different things there. Does that make sense too? Okay. All right. And then so we had Paul isn't necessarily directly addressing this, but in Romans 7, when he's talking about how we're saved from sin, one of the things he talks about is that once we die, those laws no longer apply to you. And one of the things he says, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she's released from the law of marriage. And so that's a part of it, that if both you and your spouse are living and have gotten married, then you're bound by those laws of marriage. But once one of you dies, then those laws no longer apply. All right, and then Paul later also in Ephesians, and we looked at this kind of last time too, with that one of the things he talks about with marriage is that it's not only important here in this life, but it's important because it points us to how we relate to God, both individually and kind of collectively. That therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying it refers to Christ and the church. Again, this idea is, we talked about this a little last week too, but the idea that the marriage relationship is one of the ways that we understand how God relates to his people. I think I mentioned last week too, one of my Old Testament professors talked about how God and Israel were just dating up until Mount Sinai, but then they signed on the dotted line. They made this covenant: I will be your God, you will be my people, and then they're married from that point on. And then, but then Israel, of course, people of Israel keep cheating on God, going after idols, including barely before the ink's dry for Mount Sinai. They're busy dancing and worshiping a golden calf. And so then one of the ways that idolatry is spoken of is adultery. When we went through the minor prophets this summer, we looked at Hosea. He lives that out. He's told, go marry a prostitute. Go marry someone you know will be unfaithful to you, so that you can live out how God relates to his people. Because they keep cheating on him, but he remains faithful to them. All right. So kind of looking at those questions then, why might we not need marriage then in eternity? Yeah, why might Jesus talk this way?
We have God, we have Jesus. I mean, that's a worldly, the marriage is over, so to speak, you know? And so now we're in relationship with God.
Okay, yeah, so if marriage is at least kind of is partly a picture of how we relate to God, well then if we're relating to God that way, we don't need marriage. We don't need the picture. We've got the direct connection there. You know, we're in the presence of God. We won't need those things. You know, kind of like at the end of the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul talks about faith, hope, and love, but greatest of these is love. Why? Because you don't need faith and hope in eternity, because everything's fulfilled. You still need love, but you don't need faith or hope. Because you're not hoping for anything because everything's perfect and restored. You don't need faith because you're seeing everything and able to trust in God. You don't have that involvement. So that's part of it. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Ben.
How does that relate back to Genesis, where God instituted marriage before the fall and sin? So marriage wasn't part of the perfect world.
Okay, right. Yeah. So that's another point in mind. Thank you. To the newest married member of this of the group here. So that's the other point in mind is recognizing that when we're looking at how things are in this world. So one of the things we do is we look and see, was this established before the fall or was it established after the fall? And marriage is something that was established before the fall. God creates Adam and Eve. He makes for one another. Because Adam was alone. Everything God creates is good or very good. The one thing that's not very good is that Adam is alone, and so He creates Eve out of Adam, so that he has someone to be with. And so God establishes marriage before the fall. So then in the perfect world, in the life of the world to come, if we're back in that perfect world, back to how things were supposed to be had the fall never happened, then marriage should happen. Okay, good thought. All right. Anything else?
So what you're saying is because of the fall, then it changed everything.
Right. Yeah. So that's the so some things happened, are created or instituted after the fall to help us deal with the fact that we live in a fallen world, in a sinful world. But there and other things, marriage and work especially, were created before the fall, were established before the fall as things that humanity was supposed to do. But because of sin, they're both harder to do and create conflict and things. Because remember the curses that happened because of the fall. Adam has to now toil in the fields. There's thorns, and he's going to get sweaty, and it's going to be hard, as opposed to just frolicking around the garden, naming things and doing that. And then conflict comes up between Adam and Eve. The relationship that was perfect before the fall. Now there's going to be conflict. There's going to be, conflict, disagreements, lording over each other, attempts that way, that kind of thing, and so sin affects that too. But we're looking back to the perfect relationship, and then perfection happens again with the new heaven and the new earth. All right, so some other things why we might not need marriage in eternity. So part of why God establishes marriage, makes Adam and Eve, He tells them to be fruitful and multiply. Well, in eternity, that we don't necessarily need to do that. We don't necessarily need to perpetuate the species, so to speak. They were created to be companions for each other, but in eternity we're never lonely. We're in the presence of God forever. Loneliness seems to be at least, an effect of sin in the world. And so And so that reason for marriage isn't as big anymore. Again, marriage and families teach the faith and values to future generations. In eternity, there's no need for that. We hear that in some. One of the other Lenten passages we'll hear sometimes is Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34. But it talks about how God says, I'm going to put my law in their hearts, so no one needs to teach anyone know the Lord, because they'll all know the Lord already. And so we've got that going on. That part of marriage is for families and for teaching the faith, passing on values to our children. And in eternity, we won't need to do that, because God's given us, put the law in our hearts. Which, again, another one of those things that, when people are trying to debate the existence of God and things, one of the things they'll point to in natural theology is that idea that we all have conscience. We have God's law written on our heart. It's just flawed in either A, how we read it, or B, how we follow it. That we have the fact that we know that there's right and wrong, and that we agree broadly on a lot of those things. Killing, stealing are bad. It's just we disagree on what killing and stealing is. It's stealing if someone else does it to us. If we do it to someone else, then it's not actually stealing. Those kind of things. So again, law, the law is written on our heart, but sin's corrupted all of that. We won't have that problem in eternity. All right, or again, the next. No longer shall each one teach his neighbor, each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I'll forgive their iniquity and remember their sins no more. All right. All right, and then again, it's important to remember too what Jesus is talking about here. What's Jesus' main point? Jesus is using marriage as an example because that's what the question was about. But who's he talking to? The Sadducees. And what don't the Sadducees believe in? The resurrection. And what does Jesus know that they need to believe in? The resurrection. Because they're not going to understand who he is and what he's doing there unless they believe in the resurrection. Again, Paul, in Acts we get the times where the Pharisees and Sadducees start arguing with each other about whether there's a resurrection or not, and what it means that these people are claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. Because otherwise, if you remember the raising of Lazarus, Jesus asks Martha, "Don't you believe in the resurrection?" And Martha says, "Yes, I believe in the resurrection that'll be at the last day." She's got that part down. So Jesus just needs to get her from the resurrection at the end of time to Jesus is the resurrection and life and can raise Lazarus. But if you don't believe there's any resurrection at all, then you've got an extra step to get to in there first. And so Jesus is partly the purpose of his answer here is not to talk about marriage in the eternity. His purpose is to get the Sadducees to think differently about the idea of resurrection. Does that make sense? Yeah, Al.
Just curious, after Jesus rose from the dead and was seen everywhere, do you think any of these Sadducees changed their mind?
I think a few might, but I think a lot of them didn't. You had, whether they believed different things, whether it was that what the Romans were passing around that, oh no, it was those disciples who somehow were scared enough to lock themselves in a room, but were brave enough to face down a legion of soldiers and steal a body without them noticing. So there would have been that kind of thing, and then you get further and further away from eyewitnesses, and they go, oh, they just made that up. That's so. All right, any other thoughts? All right. All right, so again, those stories of resurrection in the Old Testament that we find, this is a little more symbolic, of course, but Ezekiel 37, the Valley of Dry Bones, That's, is a bit more metaphorical for God's telling Ezekiel, look, yes, Israel looks dead because you're all in exile in Babylon, but I'm going to breathe new life into you and send you back. But he's got this image of resurrection, of all these bones clicking together and getting all the tendons and muscles and skin on, and then the breath of life going into them. So that's, of course, one example of a resurrection story in the Old Testament that the Sadducees should pay attention to, maybe, but aren't, or writing it off as a metaphor or something like that. Job talks about then how, my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. So, and part of it also is, in addition to being fairly philosophical, the Sadducees are also focused much more just on the Pentateuch, on those first 5 books of the Bible, and not so much on some of the other things, so other parts of the Bible, and so that allows them to escape most of the resurrection accounts. And
explain the part when you said, "In my flesh I will see God."
yeah,
So is that? Yeah, explain that.
okay. So that's one of the passages that we look at. Again, Job's one of the oldest books in the Old Testament, yet he's got this promise of a resurrection that his hope in death is not to just be a floating spirit, get wings, halo, harp, and flutter around the clouds for eternity. It's that even though it gets to the point where my flesh has decayed, my eyes, my flesh, in my flesh, I will see God. That there's this resurrection.
Is that reference to the disconnect between the bodily and the spirit?
Right, and so focusing in on that he's looking ahead to a bodily resurrection, not just some spiritual thing. So. All right, and then 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's great chapter on the resurrection, not only on defending that Jesus rose from the dead, but telling the Corinthians also then what that means for them. And at one point he goes, again, if in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And so, again, this is part of what Jesus is going at, that if the Sadducees are just focused on what God's told them and how that applies to their this life only, well, that's really, you focus too much on being earthly good, there's no connection later. You're missing the point. And of course for Christians it's even more so that Jesus rose from the dead, and because he physically, bodily rose from the dead, then that means that he's the first fruits. First fruits of the harvest means there's more to come. And so that's, looking ahead to our promised resurrection as well. All right. But again, that's also then one of those challenges that, of course, here at in a month and a half or so, when we get to Easter, we hear all those stories about why the resurrection didn't actually happen, how this is some mass delusion on the part of the disciples, or something like that. That trying to focus in on those kind of miraculous things don't happen. Why would we do that? But again, the reminder that for Christians, it's important, foundational, that Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah.
I'll ask another dumb question. When Christ died on the cross, a lot of people came out of the graves.
Right.
Did they not? Okay. We've never been told, or at least I've never heard of anything, whatever happened to those people. What did society think of all that?
That's a good question. We don't have a whole lot of idea about that. I think I vaguely remember a seminary professor saying, because they come out of their graves, but they're not. They don't go and see their families until after Jesus has been raised from the dead. And I vaguely remember one of my seminary professors wondering if they were playing canasta while they were kind of waiting in the tombs for these few days. But beyond that, yeah, we don't necessarily get a whole lot of things. I think there's some extra biblical accounts that purport to be from either from some of those people or about those people. But again, the idea that that the resurrection matters and happened, that yes, there's all this ancillary stuff that happens that can help us point to Jesus, but really it's the fact that Jesus appears to his disciples and rises from the dead that should give us the faith in the resurrection, and not necessarily looking at those other things. But yeah, that's always the challenge too when we, as we're reading the Bible, that we run into these parts. We're like, wait a minute, what else happens? Why didn't we build on this? And and maybe that's another thing we'll be waiting for God to reveal to us when we're with Him forever. That He has time to explain. So what really did happen to those people? Why didn't anyone else write about it? Yeah, no, good question though. Good thought. All right, anything else? All right, let's see, what else do I have? And again, that the promise David writes in the Psalms, that you will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. Looking ahead to what, that God's not going to, death may separate us from a lot of things, but it will not separate us from God. That God's promised to be with us that way. All right. So looking ahead then, looking at these ideas about marriages. So what's the most memorable wedding you've attended?
Mine.
Yours. Okay, that's probably pretty memorable. Good. Anything in particular memorable about it?
I'll pass on that.
Okay. Good. So though sometimes that's not the case. I remember I had one of my seminary classmates was, in fact, he was my roommate for first year of seminary. We'd both gone to college together. He got married between our first and second year. We were the wedding was at the chapel at Valpo. He was going to be a pastor. His wife was going to be a deaconess. They got one of the theology professors at Valpo to do the wedding, and gave this brilliant sermon about how they were both going to be serving at tables. And then, like a couple months later, that fall, they've got an off-campus apartment now, and invite their poor, lonely, single friend to come over and have a home-cooked meal instead of cafeteria food. And I say, well, so do you remember this from your wedding? And they're like, we don't remember anything. I mean, that, all despite all the work that they get, again, they're both, deep theological students. My roommate ended up going on and staying at the seminary and getting a doctorate. And yet they don't remember a thing about their wedding. Yeah, they just that idea that either the stress or the excitement or whatever, that sometimes it's hard to have those memories. No.
So when you have a wedding here,
Yes.
do people still video their weddings?
Sometimes. I mean, now that we've got this live stream system, we
were married,
do that.
And we didn't realize this was happening. Pastor Schattauer, once he started our wedding sermon, he touched the record. So we have a cassette tape.
Oh, okay.
So every year when we go to a restaurant, we put that in the car. We'd be laughing because we sounded so scared.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
But had we not had that cassette
Right.
tape of
Oh, yeah.
our wedding sermon, I would have to say I didn't remember.
Yeah.
Ed, we got married here, we got married in Ames at
I grew up at
Bethesda.
Bethesda. So Pastor Schattauer confirmed me, and he used my confirmation verse in our wedding. We loved because he first loved us. So.
I was thinking about the snow. We have what, almost 2 feet of snow, it seemed like?
It was a polar vortex.
Yeah.
March 3rd.
Yeah, that sounds-
Yeah, Don.
One of the most memorable weddings that didn't happen is one of my graduate students was going to get married to a Spanish graduate student, and they had the wedding all planned in Minnesota at her home church, and the night before, she got scared about marrying this guy that all of a sudden became very domineering, and she called the wedding off.
Oh, wow.
And there's family that come from Spain, and it
Yeah.
was a big deal. But it was probably the best thing that ever happened, but it was, oh my, pretty traumatic.
Yeah, no, definitely, that's, yeah, again, part of why you know, go through things to make sure, you know, this isn't something you would enter into inadvisedly or lightly, but seriously, reverently, and recognize it if it's not right, that do that. I still, wow.
I remember going to a wedding with Mary when we were first dating.
In Hubbard, Iowa.
In Hubbard, Iowa.
Jan and Kent Zebel, who belonged to St.
Yeah.
And
had
they
never
got him
been
on the dance floor. He was doing the polka.
Yeah. I had never been to a Lutheran,
Yeah.
you know, like, it was my first experience with the Lutheran church.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting there, I'm going like, this is weird. Yeah, really, because, you know, growing up in a Baptist church, it was, you're in the movie, so to speak, you know, a performance, you know, give me an amen, you know, that kind of stuff. But, yeah, I remember that. That was an experience. Was that my freshman year or sophomore?
You were a freshman. It was culture shock.
All right, what's the longest marriage of anyone you personally know? Have any, and what made their relationship last that long?
My parents were 74 years.
Oh, yeah, right.
74. My goodness.
You got a few years yet?
Yeah.
I think what made my parents' marriage special is they were so united in everything in spite of their differences,
Yeah.
you know. And as far as disciplining children, we couldn't work one against the other. They were a united front.
So that's important to be able to do, yeah. All right.
Bob and Jan Anderson, they're in their 60s, aren't they?
Yeah.
60.
Yeah, I forget exactly how long they've been married, but. All right. Can you think of a marriage you've seen God's purposes fulfilled? However you want to take that. Then if not, that's okay. We're kind of finishing up going through these last reflection questions. We've just got a couple minutes left. All right, so again, the most beautiful purpose of marriage is to point us to the gospel. And we talk about how, again, marriage is a picture of how God relates to us. So one of the most beautiful purpose of marriage, among all its other purposes, is to point us to the gospel. What do you think of that statement?
Don't usually think of it that way.
Yeah.
Especially when you're just married.
Yeah.
I think of it that way because maybe of the situation of being away from God.
Okay.
And I know in Mary's devotion to the church, it made me strong over the years. You know, and I could have fought it, and who knows?
Right.
You know? But yeah, you know. So define what you mean by the gospel.
Oh, always important when you talk about these things. Yeah, define the terms.
Yeah, define what.
Christ is the groom and the church is the bride.
So the gospel is what God has done for us, and so.
And Christ has honored
And Christ
all of
has,
his
yes.
vows and promises.
Yeah.
Last two questions. All right, children learn values within the context of marriage and family. What values do you feel are most important to teach future generations?
faithful.
Being faithful. Okay.
Love each other.
I guess one of the things, you know, there's ups and downs in life and in marriage, and I think the next generation has, you know, not realized that you both have to work at it, and they just give up and move on.
Yeah.
You know, there are hard times and they need to address it.
Yeah, recognizing, right, that it's, yeah, some things you need to just work through, work hard, and, you know, you made the commitment, you stick it out.
The word that comes to mind, one word for me is humility.
Humility, yeah.
Yeah, that's the one word if I would,
Yeah.
because there's a lot, but
Yeah. All right, and then again, looking ahead, since we're not talking just about marriage, but at the resurrection. What about your resurrected, glorified body are you looking forward to the most?
No pain.
No pain, yes. No pain, no illness, no sickness, no hurt eyes or hurt knees or anything like that. Yeah.
does that mean no more sin?
No more sin, yeah. So,
Because we're tempted all the time.
yeah. So, well, good. All right. We'll finish up here. Then we'll go on to our next chapter next week, which I think is the unjust. Use your wealth to win friends and influence people. It's the unjust steward parable. So.
Thank you.
Yep. So thank you very much all for coming and engaging. So.